is the Kitsune, the thinnest PS5 controller, specifically a Leverless arcade controller made by Razer, primarily targeted towards fighting games. If you're unfamiliar with the concept, this is an approach to arcade fight sticks that removes the stick entirely in favor of replacing it with 4 buttons, with the most popular example of this for a while having been the hitbox. And this is actually the first time that I've messed with this particular style of controller. The closest I've gotten in the past was actually the Mixbox, which was a play on the concept of a hitbox style controller which used WASD keys instead of the 4 buttons lined out this way. And so it's been a bit of an interesting learning experience getting the hang of it and using it. I've had my hands on it for almost 2 weeks now, and I've held off on doing a review because of the time I was putting into, well, just learning to be comfortable with it. So I just want to talk about the experiences of using this controller, what benefits it has to offer. And I think one important question that a lot of people have when seeing a design like this in the first place is, what is it like getting used to using one of these? Real quick, important disclosures to make. This video itself is not a sponsored video. However, the Kitsune that was sent to me for free for me to try out and review from Razer. So thanks to them for that. I also want to shout out real quick too that this is coming out during a year that has been very big for PlayStation hardware-wise. They had their own Edge controller come out earlier this year, along with PSVR 2. We're getting a handheld later this year, new headsets, possibly even a new revision of the system. I am planning on covering all that stuff as it comes out, so as always, if you want to see that content, make sure to not miss out by subscribing and hitting that bell icon. First things first, general overview of the controller as well as its design. Again, this is a hitbox style controller. You've got 4 buttons replacing the stick input. One of the important things about this design choice is that it makes putting certain inputs into game far easier than relying on a stick, especially if you're first learning fighting games. One of the issues that a lot of people can have when first learning on stick controls is having a tendency to accidentally overroll a little bit. For instance, one particularly popular input in fighting games is the down forward punch, something used usually for projectiles and that kind of thing. And it's not that uncommon to see people when learning fighting games for the first time to try and do that input and then accidentally jump forward because they're going a little too up on the stick near the end. And that's not really something that can happen on a controller like this because you're just pressing down forward and you're good to go. Now, obviously, the simplicity of being able to so easily pull off inputs makes these controllers a little bit more controversial compared to the traditional stick design. In fact, some styles of this controller are not even tournament legal, which the Razer Kitsune is for one very important distinction. One of the things that gets really weird with taking this approach that people were discovering is that with some fighting games, when pressing left and right at the same time, it would register as left and right at the same time, which on a stick is literally impossible. You can't be going in opposite directions simultaneously. And so that would allow for some very bizarre reads in games that could be extremely exploitive. The Kitsune tackles this issue fairly simply by making it so that when 2 opposite directions are being pushed at the same time, it is instead being read as a neutral input. So it's not reading it as forward, it's not reading it as back, it is just reading it as if a stick were sitting in the middle, as it should. Because of this adjustment, you still get some of the really big advantages of this button style input, but not something that is so powerful that it's considered just straight up abusive and cheating, thus being tournament legal. Another major standout point of this controller right away too is the fact that Razer did take advantage of the fact that this is a purely button setup controller and thus doesn't require the same kind of internals that a more traditional stick would, and so they've made it extremely thin, which is one of the really big, I think, appealing selling points of this thing. Not just in terms of bulkiness and size when you're actually using it to play, but I think even more importantly, travel. This is so much easier to fit in a backpack or a bag or just transport around, considerably simpler than most full-size sticks. As far as the mechanics of the buttons go, rather than relying on some of the traditional other third-party buttons types that have existed for fight sticks like, say, Sanwa, Razer is instead relying on their own in-house switches, which are their red optical switches. The important things about these is they don't really have a clicky register physically, and they are very silent. There's not any kind of loud tactile feedback, but they do have a really satisfying soft touch and travel distance where you know when you've pressed the button enough, but allows for very quick, rapid presses without making a ton of noise. Connectivity-wise, while I obviously don't have a cable coming out of this right now, it is a wired controller. That's actually one of the interesting little attentions to detail about this controller that I do like. Because it's not hardwired in all the time, again, that does help a lot in the travel department, making it easier to store away. But when you do want it plugged in, it actually has this nice little security latch that you can pop open to make sure that the cable sticks in. Also, as far as connectivity to different devices goes, as I said at the top of this video, this is a PS5 targeted controller. However, it does also work on PC. There's just an onboard little switch that you flick if you want to go between PC and PS5 mode. It does not support PS4 at all. You cannot hook this up to a PS4 and use it on fighting games in there, which is a bit of a limitation and can be a problem for some situations like, say, going to a local tournament, and if they're using PS4s for your system, you're out of luck. But as long as the system you're focusing on using is a PS5, it's going to work no problem, and will of course work on PS4 versions of games as long as they're running on a PS5 system. Some other features worth highlighting real quick. This does have a lock button, so it activates a tournament mode. What that basically does is that while it is in that lock position, certain buttons are no longer going to work in order to prevent you from doing something that might accidentally disqualify you, like pausing in the middle of a match, hitting the share button, home button, whatever. Those buttons will just stop working while it's in lock mode, and it's entirely focused on just the controller inputs necessary for playing a fighting game. Also, what Razer product would not be complete if it didn't also have flashy RGBs built into it? In the case of the Kitsune, it's built into the base of the system, wrapping around it. One feature of this that's really nice is that you're able to customize and control these lighting settings entirely on board. You don't need to make use of any kind of app on your PS5 or getting an app on your PC and plugging it separately there to get it set up. It's all done by putting it into tournament mode and then holding down the other disabled buttons for periods of time to activate and make changes. So you can cycle through different lighting patterns, different colors if you're relying on a static color, and even adjust the brightness intensity or speed at which some color cycling is occurring. It's certainly a feature that's very extra, but again, it wouldn't really be a Razer product if it didn't have that. Last but not least, as far as feature overview goes, there are also some customizable bits to this controller. As I mentioned earlier, it's making use of Raze's red optical switches, but those are actually installed and designed in a way that you can remove them pretty easily if you would rather use a different switch type instead. Also, the top plate for the controller can be fully removed, so if you want to take that off and paint it or customize it in some way in order to make it a little more fashionably yours, you have that option. Razer is also releasing special edition versions of this controller that have different designs shipped with it right away. The two that we know of right now being Chun-Li and Cammy for pretty obvious reasons. So tech specs and feature list aside, what is it actually like to use a controller like this? Well, one thing I think is important to point out is just my own personal background. When it comes to playing fighting games and using alternative forms of control, I had my era of focusing on using fight sticks primarily. I did that a lot during the Street Fighter 4 days. And really more recently, until I got my hands on this, I made the swap over to being a little more focused on fight pads, with the Victrix Pro BFG for the PS5 as my focus for the moment. And part of the reason why I stopped using sticks is because I kind of embraced the fact that just when it came to inputs, stick has just always been a little bit weird for me. I have found using a D-pad to be far more reliable as far as just what feels natural to me, which is what makes this controller really interesting, right? Because it's giving me that more traditional fight stick layout where I do like the button setup, but then replacing the stick that I've just always been a little uncareful with, to say the least, and giving me button inputs that feel a little more familiar. That said, using buttons for movement is certainly a bit of an adjustment phase. I wouldn't consider myself a pro fighting game player, but I am a fan of the genre, and it's something that I like to play a lot in my free time between single player games. It's really the one competitive genre I consistently go back to. And I think what's really important about that background in terms of how it ties into something like this is that the experience of swapping over from a fight pad and even using a more traditional stick over to using a 4-button setup like this, it's not nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be. I mean, when I first saw the Hitbox and similar controllers like this, I really thought that I would just not be able to get the hang of it. And while it certainly wasn't immediately natural, the time that it took to just practice inputs, it ended up becoming a much more fluid experience than I expected. A large part of this comes down to the fact that while it might look a little odd at first, the layout for the 4 directions makes a lot of sense within the context of a match. Looking at it from the top, you can see that you have 3 of the movement directions all side by side, and having these 3 in particular lined up is important because it makes a lot of the standard inputs very simple. You want to do down forward for a punch, just really quickly go from the center button down to whichever direction you need to do for forward or back. You need to do a dragon punch, it's forward, down, forward, or you can even do a little bit of a hack where you hold down and just double tap forward to have it read that input as well. Half circles, same logic. You just do the 3 buttons in a row and it's very natural. While the up button has its own separate location further down from everything else. It's the lowest button on the controller. You're meant to rest your thumb on it. And it's honestly a lot easier to just not think of it as the up button as it is just think of it simply as the jump button. I actually find myself still stumbling with this every now and then when I'm not in a match and I'm just trying to use this controller for general navigation because my brain gets really confused about the fact that the down button is location-wise above the up button. But once you're in a match and you really do just put your brain focused on the idea of this isn't up, this is jump, it makes a lot of sense, especially because for years, most games have trained us to think that the lower button on a 4-button setup is for jumping. Well, I will say that I don't think I'm at a stage yet where I feel completely fluent in this controller, let's say. I definitely need to put some more hours in to, I think, feel natural for regular matches. As far as just fighting CPU and doing practice matches and really training combos for characters go, I've begun to really get a natural feeling for this, which is fantastic. Honestly, I think the best way to really get your feet wet with something like this, especially in the example of Street Fighter, is to dive into character trials for whatever character you enjoy and just focus on training over and over and over again, because once you get a feeling for that, the initial kind of, oh no, this looks kind of weird, goes away pretty fast. Now, so far, I've mostly been talking about this in terms of how it relates to Street Fighter specifically, but obviously there are other fighting games that it can work perfectly fine for. Guilty Gear is a game that uses very similar inputs, and so it works naturally for that as well. You could certainly use this for something like Tekken, which is used for arcade controls. And if you were wondering whether or not you could use something like this to play other games, not really. I mean, if you wanted to mess around and joke with certain retro titles, you could. The primary problem being the fact that the 4 directional buttons on this register as basically the equivalent of using the D-pad on a DualSense, and so there are no right stick or left stick controls. And so if a game needs those, which, you know, most modern games do, that's not going to work. But maybe just a simple little indie game that uses 4 directional buttons? Yeah, you could use it for this if you wanted to. I also want to know too that just the general comfort of using this on your lap versus my experiences with more traditional fight sticks, really nice. It's very light. Obviously the thin body profile makes it not a huge blocky thing you're trying to set up. I think it has just the right size footprint where it sits very comfortably and naturally on my legs. And because I'm not moving a stick around left and right and doing different directions and simply pressing down on buttons, it ends up being really comfortable to use. Obviously, when it comes to different controller styles and introducing a new one like this one, your mileage with this is going to vary a little bit with what just clicks with your brain right. I will say for me, as someone who has experienced using a more traditional fight stick, went in the direction of using a fight pad more often, and then going back to this instead of a traditional stick, it's hitting a midpoint that honestly makes my brain very happy. And at least for the foreseeable future right now, is going to be my main method of playing these games. Of course, one other important talking point is the price, which it is certainly not cheap. The regular design that I'm using in this video right now goes for $299. They charge you a little bit extra if you want to get one of the Street Fighter editions with Chun-Li or Cammy on them, which is not in the realm of being an outlandish price when it comes to fight sticks. A lot of the higher quality ones can certainly get up there price-wise, but at the same time, it's definitely not one of the cheaper or more affordable options. This is something you definitely want to pick up if you consider yourself an enthusiast or you just really have the money to burn and you want to get a new method of playing your fighting games. I think it's a wonderful controller to use, but like many Razer products, it is going to cost you. So those are my thoughts on the Razer Kitsune. If you're interested in grabbing one, I do have a link posted down below in the description. As always, if you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button to let me know, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I will see you guys later.